What do some of the worst disasters have in common? It's not acts of God, bad luck, or just a careless mistake. For Andrew Hopkins, it's an organisation convincing itself that the disaster it fears most can't happen here. A common factor in both the Moura and Gretley mine disasters was that management believed the mine was protected from the hazard in question, and therefore it can't happen here. G'day everyone, welcome to Safe As. I'm Dr. Ben Hutchinson. We're exploring two studies today from Andrew Hopkins. So the first, from obviously Hopkins 2000, A Culture of Denial, Sociological Similarities Between the Moura and Gretley Mine Disasters, published in Journal of Occupational Health and Safety, Australia and New Zealand. I'm using a lot of direct quotes here, as Hopkins explains it better than I can. This paper compares the underlying sociological and organisational factors behind both the Moura and Gretley mine disasters. I'm not going to go into them in too much depth, you can look them up if you're interested. First, Hopkins says that while every disaster has its own unique set of events, it does not follow that every disaster requires a unique explanation. Research, including Barry Turner's work and much research since, has shown that some phenomena underlie most, if not all, disasters. For instance, Turner highlighted that misinformation always plays a critical role. There's a mixture of both active and latent conditions, and according to some, all disasters can be traced to management system failure. Both accident inquiries remarked that management in both cases believed this event couldn't happen at their mine. Hence, a common factor in both disasters was that mine management mistakenly believed that the mine was protected from the hazard in question. In mining, coal exposed to air can heat up slowly, spontaneous combustion, and if not properly ventilated, can reach the ignition point of methane. At Moura, there was an operating belief that spontaneous combustion took at least 6 months to develop, the so-called incubation period. So if work was completed before the 6 months, there was thought to be little risk of ignition. And while this belief was widespread in industry, it was without foundation. It spread by word of mouth and had no substantiating evidence. Instead, for Hopkins, it was in fact a mistaken belief, and the Moura explosion occurred within the supposed incubation period. Importantly, management took the mistaken view that the mine was safe from spontaneous combustion because they were still within that 6-month window. At Gretley, a known risk was mining near an old abandoned mine that had been flooded. Maps were obtained and work was planned at what was believed to be a safe distance from the old workings. However, because of a drafting error made by the department, the maps were inaccurate, and according to the inquiry, management didn't verify the accuracy of the maps, as the official inquiry found it had a responsibility to do, but simply accepted the plans at face value. Hopkins argues that management at both mines were aware of the hazards and believed they had taken appropriate action to protect themselves. But in his view, they accepted the validity of information acquired from others without any attempt to verify its accuracy. Critically, they accepted this information on face value when the safety of their operations depended critically on this information. Next, Hopkins unpacks what he calls warnings ignored. Hopkins argues that warning signs of both mines before the disasters were dismissed or ignored. He suggests that the rationalizations for ignoring or dismissing these warning signs stem from factors like the normalization of deviance and ad hoc criteria used to explain away unexpected findings. The rate of carbon monoxide, or CO, is a sign of spontaneous combustion. The greater the rise of CO production, the higher the risk of ignition. At that time, the rule of thumb was that CO over 10 litres a minute required investigation, while over 20 litres a minute indicated considerable danger. The rate before the accident was above 10 but below 20 for some weeks prior to the accident, yet it wasn't acted on. A rationalisation from mine management was that a new mining method was leaving considerable loose coal in the area. So higher CO production, at least slow and steady rises, was to be expected. Hopkins then draws on Vaughan's work on the normalisation of deviance, discussing how performance issues with the O-rings were identified over several launches. But because these defects in the O-rings hadn't totally failed, over time their malfunctioning was reconceptualised as normal, and the risk of total failure came to be judged as acceptably low. He suggests a similar effect was at play at Gretley, where signs of water accumulation were discounted through other rationalizations. Next, he looks at this idea of ad hoc criteria. So people apparently dismissed warning signs using this ad hoc criteria, such as to arbitrarily raise the threshold of what could count as a danger signal, and then to argue that the observed signs had not crossed this arbitrary threshold. Arbitrary in hindsight, of course. At Moura, the prevailing view was that the slow and steady rises in CO were normal, whereas a rapid rise was the real warning sign. Hopkins says this logic was confused, since an exponential rise in CO isn't a warning sign of potential danger, It's an indicator that a fire is already raging. Gretley had a similar mechanism at play, where ad hoc criteria rationalised water accumulation. In that case, the water was explained away as a mere trickle, rather than water squirting out. By defining this ad hoc criteria of what counts as a warning sign, squirting water versus a trickle, the manager had implicitly defined a new test for danger. Water squirting out of the face under high pressure is an indicator of danger. A trickle is not. Nevertheless, no justification was provided for this new test. Next, Hopkins discusses the role of intermittent warnings, which many warnings are. An example at Moura was where the CO rate was measured at 19 litres a minute, just under that magic 20 litres a minute threshold for danger. Because the reading was so close, and because the warnings were intermittent, the reading was challenged as false. Next, Hopkins ties these rationalizations together in what he calls the culture of denial. He writes, "New evidence appears reliable and informative if it's consistent with one's initial beliefs. Contrary evidence tends to be dismissed as unreliable, erroneous, or unrepresentative. People may experience an uneasy state when beliefs and evidence are inconsistent, called cognitive dissonance. This requires one to adjust either the belief or the evidence." Hopkins notes, where the belief is strong, it's the evidence which is adjusted. He argues that both minds adjusted the evidence to align with their false belief of safety, this apparent culture of denial. This enabled management to deny that there was any immediate danger, no matter the evidence. Next, we'll move on to another study from Hopkins. This is unpacking some of the findings from the ESSO trial from 2002, titled Lessons from Longford, the trial, published in Journal of Occupational Health and Safety, Australia, New Zealand. In the trial, ESSO tried to persuade the judge of their otherwise very good safety record. Notably though, they relied on lost time injuries. In Hopkins' words, LTIs are a dubious measure of safety. They're influenced primarily by recording practices, like whose injuries are counted, and by injury management strategies, like keeping injured workers at work, photocopying stuff. And they generally represent high frequency, low consequence matters. By contrast, major hazard events like explosions tend to be rare and may not generate LTIs for many years. In Hopkins' words, a focus on LTIs tends to divert attention away from the management of major hazards, and this happened at Longford. ESSO proudly explained how they went 1.7 million hours without an LTI. And while this wasn't their only focus or measure, it highlights a focus on routine injuries over major hazard events. Hopkins also explains that effective risk control means adopting control measures linked to specific hazards. Many major accidents occur when controls that were supposed to be in place were not, like the permit to work system at Piper Alpha. So ongoing safety depends on regular assurance that these critical controls are working as expected. Organizations must adopt indicators that measure control effectiveness. And there also must be measures of how effectively the management system is monitoring and maintaining these controls. Hopkins provides a table of example indicators, not as best practice, but as illustrative examples, and notes that LTI is incapable of assuring those elements. Next, they unpack the safety management system. This was covered a bit in the Royal Commission, but also in the trial that had a lot of criticism directed at the SMS. Directly quoting the Commission, the safety management system was said to be repetitive, circular, and to contain unnecessary cross-referencing. Much of its language was impenetrable, and importantly, the Commission gained the distinct impression that there was a tendency for the administration of this safety management system to take on a life of its own, divorced from operations in the field. So importantly, people were managing the system and its documents over the practical functioning of the plant and its major hazards. In the trial, it was remarked that one cannot simply discharge one's duty by creating a monumental paper structure and then not implementing it. Hopkins draws on earlier major hazard guidance from an Australian safety regulator, noting two ways that SMSs can fail. One, a virtual safety management system, one that contains the right management elements and the correct control measures, but doesn't reflect how those control measures are managed in reality. That's your sort of conventional workers imagine workers. And two, a misguided safety management system, one with the right management system elements, but managing the wrong control measures, those not linked to major incidents. So the virtual SMS is a paper system which fails at the implementation stage, while a system which focuses on LTIs as its primary measure of safety is misguided. Further, there were critical issues with alarm management at Longford. Control room operators could receive hundreds, even thousands of process upset alarms each day. Many were nuisance alarms with no real impact. But in cancelling these, no distinction was made between nuisance alarms, and critical alarms. Hence, critical alarms could be ignored or cancelled without due attention. The trial also unpacked critical procedures. Now, not all procedures had to be documented, but if they were critical, they probably should have been. The prosecution's position was, you might not need written procedures in a milk bar if you spill some milk, but you do need them in a volatile and flammable gas plant with complex procedures. Problematically, ESSO had no written procedures for dealing with cold temperature hazards, the very issue involved in that accident. And because there were no procedures, there were no specific training informing workers about this hazard. ESSO did provide generalised training for operators, but it was said to lack the quality and focus needed for safety critical procedures. Therefore, for Hopkins, this procedure provides guidance on where organisations should focus training attention on the critical procedures necessary for risk reduction. Finally, ESSO in the trial had a tendency to blame the principal operator involved in the accident. The operator was said to have had the necessary information and failed to take actions due to individual factors. This wasn't accepted in sentencing by the judge, who noted, the truth is there was only one entity responsible for lack of knowledge on that day, ESSO. It, and it alone, should have properly trained the operators and supervisors, not only in production, which it did, but also in safety. It, and it alone, failed to do so. The operator and the employees did not fail. So what can we make of the findings? Hopkins provides the following suggestions for countering these accident logics and cultures of denial. There's limited value in trying to change the various beliefs making up the culture of denial, because even though some might be corrected or changed, others would very likely develop in their place. And such beliefs are, in any case, almost inevitable. Instead, one method is to limit the discretion exercised by decision makers, whereby decision making must be structured by introducing imperatives to action in certain circumstances which rule out the option of doing nothing. Also, after identifying the major hazards and action plans, these plans must involve the usual hierarchy elements, hazard identification, risk assessment, etc., but also how they should deal with the possibility that crucial information on which safety of the enterprise depends may be incorrect. Also, the plans must identify warning signs, which will be treated as triggers to action, and what actions must be taken and by whom and when. If management are to take no action, Hopkins suggests they should record these decisions in writing, along with the reason. In all, Hopkins argues for structured decision making so that certain warning signs are identified and actioned, and so that systems rule out the option of doing nothing. Disasters are, often, in hindsight, preceded by warnings. But warnings don't protect anyone by themselves. What matters is whether the organisation has built a system that can better process signal from noise, makes it easy to follow an acceptable process, and makes it hard to explain warnings away. Because, as the culture of denial suggests, the expression, "it won't happen here," is among the most dangerous myths around. That's it on Safe As. Please subscribe and like and comment directly on the videos on YouTube, and link in the show notes to support the channel.